welcome you all here tonight, and we're also broadcasting this on a webinar session. So tonight we have three speakers real quick. So we have Joan Schofield, who's the current president of CREW, which is the Cascadia Regional Earthquake Work Group. So she's going to give a little bit overview of CREW. And then we have Joan Gomberg, who's a seismologist with the USGS. She's going to give a little bit of a setting of geology and what's going on. And then our featured speaker is Jon Mitchell, and Mitch is the manager for the Canterbury Regional Emergency Management. And he's going to go over what's been going on in the Christchurch area and what that looked like and how they worked on a little bit on response and a little bit on recovery for us. So I'll turn it over to Joan.
Hi, good evening, everybody. I wanted to tell you a little bit about CREW. CREW is the Cascadia Region Earthquake Work Group. We are a public-private partnership, and our mission is to try and reduce the effects of an earthquake in the Cascadia region. Cascadia region runs from mid-British Columbia down to about Crescent City, California. It is a subduction fault, which Joan will talk about, and it's very similar to both the Chilean and the Japanese fault. Our goals are to promote the efforts to reduce the loss of life and property damage from earthquakes, to educate and motivate decision makers, managers, and the general public to reduce the risk associated with earthquakes, and to foster productive linkages between scientists, critical infrastructure providers, businesses, and government in order to improve the resilience of communities after an earthquake. We have two main functions. We have an education and outreach function, which is currently partnering with other groups in the area and also with FEMA to have outreach for business and small business communities. We have a recovery and mitigation section, which is actually just being stood up, which is going to spend more time on actual science of recovery and mitigation, and they plan on doing some webinars. We have a website, which is www.crew.org. We plan to have this webinar and the other webinars that our committees will do available to download on that site. And now I'd like to welcome Joan Gomberg, who is going to tell us a little bit about the background of this area. Joan is with USGS, and she's affiliated with the University of Washington.
Can everybody hear me?
Hi, you can just.
This is for the webinar.
Ah, okay.
Okay, let's see. This is going to take some. Oh, can I switch to advance? Okay, great. Okay, well, I'm going to try to give you a little bit of the more scientific background about this earthquake and how it relates to us here in the Northwest. And I would greatly appreciate it if you have a question. Just raise your hand, right? You can interrupt me. I'd much prefer to be interrupted than have you get lost and not know what I'm talking about. So again, please raise your hand or jump up and down or something to get my attention. And I hope to show you that the science behind earthquakes is both understandable and actually useful. Okay? Well, since I'm a seismologist and geologist, we always like to start with a map. And this is, of course, a map of where we live in the Northwest. And as Jon mentioned, we live in what geologically is called a subduction zone. How many people have not heard of plate tectonics? Okay, that's good. Can people hear me if I go away from the microphone? Okay, great. Not as well? Okay. I'll try to do it without actually pointing. What's happening here, and on this map, you'll see that black line between the Juan de Fuca plate and the North American plate. So the surface of the Earth is broken up into these plates, and we sit on top of the North American plate, and just to the west is this little plate called the Juan de Fuca plate, and the two plates are actually colliding with one another. And the point at which they meet is that black line with the little arrowheads on it. They're moving together at about 40 millimeters per year. That's about the rate at which your fingernails grow. Can anybody guess how we know how fast it's moving? We can measure. We can actually measure it. Any guesses? Okay, we actually use GPS to measure the very slow motion of the plate. Just the same GPS system that you use in your car can tell us. And the reason we want to know that is that tells us, as you'll see in a minute, how often we should expect earthquakes. Basically, the faster they're colliding, the more frequently we have earthquakes. And I'll explain, I hope, in a minute, why that's the case. And another feature of this particular subduction zone and New Zealand as well, and Japan, is that one plate sinks. When the two plates collide, one of them sinks down beneath the other one. And this is where geology is actually important. The Juan de Fuca plate is the one that sinks. And we can tell that just from looking at the colors on this map. Can anybody guess why the Juan de Fuca plate sinks and not the North American plate? That's something to do with the rock. Yes, very good. As you can see, the Juan de Fuca plate is largely made up of oceanic rocks, the rocks beneath the water. And North America is continent, and those rocks are lighter. So the heavier rocks are the ones that sink. Well, this is the situation in New Zealand. It's a bit more, wait, let me go back here just 1 second. These red dots, I should point out, are the locations of earthquakes that have occurred in the last century. The larger, greater than magnitude 6.5 earthquakes. One of the things you can notice about this subduction zone is that it has very few earthquakes. The three dots in the Puget Sound area are one of those has been a small earthquake, and those are not typically. I'll talk a bit about those in a minute. But basically, what happens is we don't seem to have a lot of little earthquakes. When we do, we tend to have just big ones. That's a unique feature of this. This is called the subduction zone, where the two plates collide. That's a unique feature of this region, but it still means this is still earthquake country. It just tends to be larger. The yellow triangles are volcanoes, which is also very typical of this kind of geologic environment. Well, we go now to New Zealand, where, again, this is mostly a subduction zone, but it's more complicated, as you can see from this more complicated map. In the northern part of New Zealand is the subduction zone. The Pacific plate is moving in towards the Australian plate and is going down beneath it. The Pacific plate is sinking beneath it. In the middle of New Zealand, where that red line, and again, that red line in this case is where the two plates meet. The motion is actually sideways, much like the San Andreas Fault. And the earthquakes that happened recently in the last year and a half are shown in that black circle. And one thing you'll notice about this is those are not right on the plate boundary. Those are plates, and I'll explain that in the next two slides, but those are plates that happen within the crust. And I'll now illustrate that. And that has some very important consequences in terms of how dangerous these kinds of earthquakes are. Okay, so this is, again, our region here, which we call geologically Cascadia. How many people have heard that term? Cascadia? Okay, good. This is known as the Cascadia subduction zone. But you can see this is a map view, and then at the front is a cross-section. So we take a slice through the earth, that's what it would look like. And the little stars are different kinds of earthquakes. So we basically have three kinds of earthquakes. I'm just going to talk about two of them here. Well, as the Wanafuka plate sinks down, and that's that gray band going down, it doesn't do it very gracefully, unfortunately. But there's a big area where it's stuck. So, well, right along where the sort of zipper looks like is where the plate, the two plates are stuck together. So they're continuously being pushed, but they're stuck. And stresses build up as a result of that until the rocks can't stand the stress anymore, and bang, they go. And that's what makes these giant earthquakes. Okay, so that area there is the interface between the two faults, between the two plates. It's a one giant fault. And that gets stuck, the stresses build up for hundreds of years until all of a sudden, within a matter of seconds, it breaks and moves. And where did this just happen? Did they come? Japan, right. This is exactly the same situation that led to the earthquake in Japan. Okay, and because this, as Joan said, the plate interface goes all the way from British Columbia to Northern California. That's one giant fault. And therefore, we can have these very giant earthquakes. Well, another place that we get earthquakes as a result of this collision is within the plates themselves. Remember, this is rock we're talking about. It doesn't just want to bend and nicely move along, but it's being squeezed, and within the plates you get earthquakes. And those are shown in the circles here, inside the crust. Now, because you need faults to make earthquakes, these faults are smaller, and thus the earthquakes are smaller. But why might they be more dangerous? Very good. Man, done his homework. That's right. They're more dangerous, as we'll see, because they're right underneath our feet. Okay, well, this is now, we're in New Zealand. And one of the lessons of this earthquake was a big surprise. This is, as I said, you need a fault to have an earthquake. An earthquake is basically motion on a crack. And you have to have the cracks. Most earthquakes occur on existing cracks. This is a map of the area around the earthquake. The red lines are faults that were mapped. And the one down in the corner there is the one that broke in September of 2010. That earthquake, that fault was not on the map prior to that earthquake. The numbers on the map tell us about how fast those faults are moving. And as you can see, the big actor there is that big red line that's moving at 27 millimeters a year. That's geologically, that's fast. That is where the big hazard is in New Zealand. But you can see the fault that broke is moving much, much slower. In fact, we didn't even know about it prior to the earthquake. But every now and then, one of these seemingly unimportant and even unknown faults breaks in an earthquake. And as you'll see, if it happens to be in the right place, it can be have very, very significant effects. This is what we call in business a low probability event. It's something that is unexpected or doesn't have a very big chance of happening, but that does not mean it's impossible, clearly. Okay, as I mentioned, this fault was completely hidden before. This is up in the corner here. You see a map of the area with the relief is shaded. And you can see the fault, the Greendale fault there was not known about prior to the earthquake. And the area is basically, that's where big agriculture happens. It's basically flat plains, it's the Canterbury Plains. Well, these other photographs here, and I meant to say initially I got many of these slides from a colleague from New Zealand, graciously lent them to me. These are pictures of what the ground looked like immediately after the earthquake. It's now very clear that there is a fault there. You don't need to be a trained geologist to see the offset in the road and the deformation around where the fault came to the surface. Well, this is now a map of Puget Sound, and the black lines are the faults we know about and where they would appear at the surface if we could see them all. Some of them are somewhat hidden. We think we know where all the major faults are in Puget Sound, but as we've just learned from New Zealand, we shouldn't be quite so cocky, and there may be some surprises, but we certainly know about these, and there are quite a few of them. Another thing that this map shows, this is a geologic map, which shows the distribution of rocks at the surface. And that is, as you will see in the pictures from New Zealand, the type of material that's at the surface, the kind of rock, is really, really important in an earthquake. And you'll see why very graphically in a few minutes when I show you some of the pictures of the effects of this earthquake, the earthquakes in New Zealand. The good thing is we know a lot about the rocks that are at the surface, and we can go out and measure them and so forth. And we know we can predict how they're going to react when they get shaken. Well, just to illustrate a little bit about what we know in this area of the world, although it's subtle to many people, there are many signs that this is earthquake country. This is Bainbridge Island in Puget Sound, and this red area around it is a bit odd, and that's what we call a raised beach. And anybody other than the man dancing, oh my God, want to guess what created this? Why does this beach look so peculiar? No brain. No. Okay, this area, all that area that's reddish and flat was once underwater. That's why it's flat. In about 1,100 years ago, an earthquake broke the Seattle Fault and raised up the land and brought what was once underwater now above land. So this is direct evidence that the Seattle Fault has moved geologically recently. Well, this is what faults look like in Puget Sound. You can see underneath the vegetation here, there's a little break in the slope. And that topography, that subtle topography, is actually, and geologists have dug that up, that was formed during past earthquakes. That's what we call a fault scarp. Well, the vegetation is a bit of a nuisance if you're a seismologist or a geologist. So for other purposes, there are now tools to just get rid of all that vegetation using something called LIDAR, which is imagery taken from an airplane, which allows you to strip away and make very high-resolution topographic maps. And you can see there are these lineations between the points of the red triangle. Those are fault scarps. Those lineations were created by motion on the region's fault. So that's another way that we can map the fault, not just here, but in many places around the world now. Okay. Let's go back now to New Zealand and what some of the really obvious lessons are for us here and anywhere. A big lesson about this earthquake is the importance of aftershock. How many people were here during the Nisqually earthquake? Okay, and how many people remember the aftershock? Okay, there were basically about 3 aftershocks. That was it. That was a very different type of earthquake. It was deep, which those earthquakes tend not to have aftershocks. These shallow earthquakes do have aftershocks. And that's a big, important lesson from this. These are maps of the shaking due to earthquakes. The one on the left here is the earthquake that occurred in September, magnitude 7.1, where it's red, basically where it shakes harder. And you can see there a large area shook pretty hard. The other map with the little red area just underneath Christchurch is the magnitude 6.3 aftershock that occurred in February. And that's the one that really did all the destruction. And the reason is, like many things, location. The earthquake occurred right underneath the city. And that, as a sea, has big consequences. Well, these are 2 buildings from downtown Christchurch, a fairly new building and an old historic building. This is what they look like after the earthquake, the magnitude 7.1 in September. And this is what they look like after the magnitude 6.3 in February. So the aftershock, now they may have been weakened slightly from the first earthquake, but it was really the proximity of this earthquake, the fact that it was right underneath the city, that made it so destructive. Well, so that's one lesson about aftershocks. It really matters where they are. I'm told, and Don can correct me, that they still have not done any rebuilding in Christchurch because they keep having aftershocks. And they continue to go on as we speak. So all these the basic message in this, all these little dots are the locations of aftershocks that have occurred since the earthquake in September, the first large earthquake in September. Okay, well, in addition to the shaking, earthquakes have what we would call secondary hazards. This really illustrates the spectacular consequence of what we call rock falls. This rock here was not there before February. It came from up the slope here, the top, and rolled through that man's house, which you can see there, out to where he's standing. And again, this was shaking used by the 6.3 aftershock, not the earthquake in September. Well, we have rock falls and landslides are caused by shaking, and they can happen anywhere. This is a picture after the Nisqually earthquake in Salmon Bay in Puget Sound, and where we had localized landslides. Another huge, and remember I said that the rock, the type of material, the geology right in the area, the affected area is critically important, and this illustrates really graphically why. This area is highly prone to a phenomenon called liquefaction. Liquefaction is a lot like the material, loose sediments basically turn into quicksand when they're shaken. And oftentimes, as happens here, huge amounts of water come squirting up out of the ground, carrying sand and silt with them. These places have all dried out now, but as you can see, they're just buried in many feet of sand that came extruding out of the ground as a result of this shaking. These are just some places, I guess, they're having issues with where to put all, as they clear it out. There are just mountains of it being piled up. And this is really because of the type of geology that that exist to meet the city there. Well, we don't have quite that extent of liquefiable material, but we do have it in place of it. This is a picture from the Scully earthquake. You can see these little sort of volcano-looking features. That's the result of liquefaction. Basically, the sand underneath the ground gets pressurized and comes squirting up with the water and makes these little sort of sand volcanoes right after the earthquake. And finally, just to complete the science lesson, I'll show you the more nerdy stuff. This is, I actually saw John talk the other day, and he talked about turning the earthquake into an opportunity. And for seismologists and geologists, and I suppose emergency managers, these are really opportunities to learn lessons for the future. This is a seismologist putting in a seismograph to record the aftershocks. And we can, as I hope to show you, you too can do this. This is not rocket science. That we can learn really valuable things through this, which will help us predict what could happen and to build how we're going to build against the effects of the earthquake. So this is a type of information that we get out of these boxes that this guy is installing there. Okay, it's a little bit complicated. This is the last slide, so bear with me. Time, this is basically a record. How many people have an EKG where you plug in your heart and you see it? Well, this is the same kind of thing, but you're taking the pulse of the ground. Time is running along the horizontal axis, and there's 3 recordings here showing the 3 different directions that the ground moves. So the one that's sort of more jittery on the bottom is measuring the vertical motion of the ground as it goes up and down as the waves pass by. The other 2 are measuring the horizontal motion of the ground as it goes in the 2 perpendicular directions. Well, one of the things that, without a lot of training, and I think you can notice it too, is it's going up. You can see the ground oscillating, and then all of a sudden it starts the amplitude, the size of the motion gets way smaller. At that point, what's happened that I've marked there is the ground has begun to liquefy. And because it's turning into this soupy stuff, it can no longer move as much. So we can actually, from this, infer a lot about what does it take to cause liquefaction, what are the motions that lead to liquefaction, and help us predict in the future what the likelihood of liquefaction might be. And finally, if we take just a similar kind of recording, and now all they've done is colored in the top part of it. This tells us the motions are on the vertical axis. We measure these motions in terms of G, which stands for gravity. Basically, 1G is what keeps you on the ground. If you're accelerated with minus 1G, you become airborne. Well, that's not a very good thing to do to your building, is to subject it to a minus 1G or 1G acceleration. Well, you can see from this recording that the ground shaking in this earthquake, even though this was the magnitude 6.3, exceeded 1G quite a few times. The motions in this earthquake were just enormous for a variety of, but information like this helps us understand why there was destruction in places and so forth. And I think I'll get that and take any questions. I've now got the pleasure of introducing the real speaker, Jon, who goes by Mitch, and I'll let him explain why, Mitchell. He is the manager of the Canterbury Regional Emergency Management Office for South Island, New Zealand. Mitch has been the EMO manager and alternate regional response controller for the last 3 years. Before before that, he was the Regional Emergency Management Planner for the Canterbury Civil Defense Emergency Management Group for 6 years. Mitch was a duty regional controller during the September 2010 quake response and the planning intelligence chief of staff of the Integrated Response Coordination Center following the February earthquake. As well as a recent earthquake, Mitch has a depth of response coordination training and experience from New Zealand, Australia, the UK, and Canada. His response experience includes floods, snowstorms, human disease, pandemics, civil unrest, foot and mouth disease, wildfire, and drought. Mitch is the local government New Zealand representative to the National Coordinated Incident Management System Steering Committee, was the lead writer of the New Zealand Local Government Emergency Management Pandemic Planning and Response Guidelines, and team member of the Welfare and Emergencies Emergency Management Plan Review and the Tsunami Signage Guideline Project. He has taken a lead role in facilitating the introduction of web-based emergency management information systems for all of New Zealand. Mitch's background includes being a university teaching fellow in geography, law enforcement strategic intelligence officer with related roles in the defense community, and a mountain guide and ski field operations manager. Wow. For fun, I know when he has time, Mitch trains for and runs an occasional off-road marathon. So, without further ado.
Thanks, everyone. That was an excellent presentation, Joan. I'll just skip through some of my slides. They've been covered in far better detail than I ever could. I'd like to thank Thurston County for bringing me over here. It's been extremely valuable for me the last few days, getting to meet a whole range of people, whether they're representatives of community groups or emergency services or emergency management agencies, and some of the hazard agencies as well. It's been very worthwhile just for me from that perspective, so hopefully you'll get something out of me being here as well. The reason I go by Mitch and not John is when I started in the Emergency Management Office about 10 years ago, there were 6 of us there called John, so we all had to be called something else. I'll answer to many things Mitch will do. Okay. I'll just mention before I start, though, that I'm here. I've taken leave to be here from my job. I spend quite a bit of time in the Pacific Northwest. Our office has a strong relationship with Emergency Management British Columbia, and someone from our office is there every year. We deliver training in New Zealand for emergency response coordination based on the training that's delivered there by the Justice Institute of British Columbia, and I'll be there at the end of the month for their conference as well. So I'm not representing our organisation, or I'm certainly not representing the New Zealand government. I'm talking to you about the experiences I've had and the events over the last few months. But also that is informed by the work that's been done in the reviews from those responses and the recovery effort as well. So just to go to a slightly different scale from what Joan was talking about, we might be people who are separated by a common but, slightly common language, but we also have in common some of the risks. And one of those, of course, is the Pacific Ring of Fire. And I don't know about you, but given the events happening off Chile recently, in fact, several events down there, off Japan, events in the Central Pacific area, and certainly events in New Zealand, I get the feeling that there's something going on out there. So I think it's wonderful that the work that's going on in the Pacific Northwest to be prepared for those sorts of events, if they should happen, and let's hope they don't, but if they do, you're going to be in a better position than a lot of communities, so good on you. This is the region that I live and work in. Every region in New Zealand, every local authority in New Zealand after 2002 with new legislation that came in was required to enter into a partnership with all of the other local authorities within their regional boundaries. So we don't have a federal system in New Zealand. We don't need to. It's about the size of California. It's about the population of Washington State. So we have regions. There's 16 of them in the country. This is the Canterbury region, which is by far the largest geographically. It's the second largest by population. Before the earthquake at least, there were about 480,000 people living there. Christchurch is the main centre with about 380,000. Timaru was the next largest, was about 40,000 people. Anything over 40,000, it can just about call itself a city, and it's got a cathedral as well. So apparently that's another qualifier, but they haven't quite got there yet. Okay, and that's the port of Littleton, which is quite strategic for Canterbury. Most of the supplies for the region generally come in through that port. This is the west coast with the Alpine Fault running along it. There's major coal fields producing very high quality coal that goes to Japan to make steel, to build stuff that goes all over the world. So the railway lines come through across the Alpine Fault, alongside highways, and come out here. The Canterbury Plains, as Jon said, is a major agricultural area. New Zealand exports 33 to 40% of the world's milk, cheese, and dairy products. And so particularly the more industrial end of that. But in the Canterbury Plains recently, over the last 10 years, have become a very major source of that with significant irrigation in the area. Big hydro electricity generation in the south, very much like eastern Washington State, other than the fact that we don't have nuclear power generation, and I doubt that we ever will after the events of this year. So regional coordination. Some people think about New Zealand, they think of it as a lovely South Pacific island, palm trees waving in the breeze. Well, that's true in some places. This was 2006, June, July 2006. So only a couple of years after our regional arrangements were formally in place, the first time we got to apply those coordinated response arrangements across the region was an event that almost fit the regional boundaries perfectly. So from an emergency management geek perspective, that was a perfect storm. And it got us into the mode of working in that sort of environment. We didn't really need to use the game until September last year. So as Jon said, this map was produced prior to 2004 to go into our regional emergency management plan. And although there were no fault lines identified or no active fault lines known underneath the plains area, part of that is because there are hundreds of metres of gravel and silt in places that have come out of the mountains, particularly up the end of the glacial period. So if there were any fault lines, they wouldn't necessarily show because they're so deep. And although, yes, today you can see when after September, the offset in hedgerows and roads and power lines and railway lines, a whole range of things, the actual surface has settled back down largely. You wouldn't actually know. So it's only with European developments that you can see the results of that. But it wasn't that we didn't know there were faults there. We just didn't know where they were, because there have been events over the last 200 years or so that are in recorded history that demonstrate that clearly there are. You just couldn't tell where they were, and they come along with a bit of a shock. And there's also oral history from the indigenous people, the Māori as well. So you've seen that. So in that area, and Jon demonstrated that very well, in an area where we didn't know that there were exactly, we certainly know there is now. But our group plan said that there was a 99% likelihood of there being a magnitude 6 or larger earthquake in the next 50 years when we wrote the plan, because the geologists could tell us that. They just couldn't tell us where and when. So Jon's covered most of this. There was one death in that event, and that was a consequential event. It wasn't due to unreinforced masonry falling on the person that died, but they had a heart attack, and the ambulance couldn't get to them because of debris in the streets. And by the time they did, it was too late. This is the sort of image, and Jon showed some of those. If you saw it in the news at the time, this is the jeweler's shop outside which the media tended to set up their cameras because it was pretty graphic. But, travelling around the Pacific Northwest, I see a lot of buildings like this before this photograph was taken. Many of these buildings in Canterbury have been converted to cafes and other activities. And if they have been, they generally strengthened from what they were when they were built about 100 years ago. Not all of them were, though. So one of the features of this event was the time of day that it happened, 4:45 in the morning. Quite significant. So it's just an aerial photo or low-level satellite photograph. That's the Port of Lyttelton there. That's the Lyttelton Harbour. That's all of the Christchurch city area. That's the Waimakariri River, a major river that flows out, and the town of Kaiapoi as well. I'll talk a little bit about that. There's an estuary here. Talk a bit about that from time to time during this presentation, I think. And this is Akaroa Harbour, which is normally just a little fishing village. People go from the Akaroa village here out to look at dolphins and seals, occasional whales. And it was a French settlement. New Zealand nearly became a French colony, which from my perspective would have been great because the food would have been better than we ended up with the British. But, you know. So if you, in fact, and nowadays, if you want to look at historic architecture in the Canterbury area, Christchurch and Lyttelton used to be. Lyttelton was a wonderful little historic town. There are virtually none of the historic buildings. We've got to go all the way out here to Akaroa. So some of the impacts from that event. Jones covered quite a bit of this, but one of the interesting things was that the infrastructure wasn't that badly affected, although, you know, 7+ earthquake magnitude you would expect there to be. But a lot of work had been put in, particularly by the local electricity company, Orion Energy, who there was a regional critical infrastructure project done about 15 years ago that identified this sort of hazard, or predominantly at that stage the Alpine Fault earthquake, which would probably generate something like an magnitude 8.4, and the shaking would go for, rather than perhaps 20 seconds, as occurred in this case, would go for 4 minutes. So the impact would be different. But the electricity infrastructure stayed together extremely well. They spent about $13 million over the previous decade. And when the September event happened, they believed that investment probably saved them $40 to $50 million. Which is interesting, but for me, it's the fact that the services were able to continue and the communities were able to continue to operate relatively normally. And because so many other services are dependent on electricity these days, telecommunications continued very well, water supplies were able to continue because pumps are still working, a whole range of things. So it was in that event, it was mostly this older unreinforced masonry that was damaged. And that's another view of that jeweller shop. Interestingly, though, upstairs, there was an English language school. Christchurch had become quite a centre for young people to come from predominantly Asian countries, and there'd be thousands of them in Christchurch at any one time, particularly in the warmer months. Well, Japanese and Koreans would also come in the winter, so they'd go snowboarding as well. So a lot of them were in cheaper buildings around town, and so that took quite a hit in the September event. And then that affected the community as well because there weren't as many people who worked in the industry. So it had a particular hit, but so did tourism in general. Productive industry, though, wasn't affected quite anywhere near as bad because it was predominantly to the west of the city on more solid ground. Just a few more images of some of the impact. Parks and recreation managers would have been crying, and some of them were. For them, it was disaster. This is a BMX bike track in Kaiapoi, that community to the north. But for the local kids, it was awesome. It was just another challenge for them. You know, they got out there and had a great time, and they could get away from their parents who were worrying about a whole lot of other things. The regional council that pays my salary, one of the projects they had in place for about the previous 5 years or so was a clean heat project to get rid of open fires across, particularly in Christchurch, which was older. And Timaru to some extent to the south. And that was predominantly getting rid of old open fires that had brick chimneys. After the September event, that project was scrapped. Wasn't really needed anymore. Not to get rid of the fires anyway, but there certainly was to then put alternative heating in place, and that morphed into something else. Even in rural parts of the area where people thought they would be more resilient because they have water tanks of their own, that sort of thing, they've proved to be relatively vulnerable. You wouldn't be allowed to build anything like that. You wouldn't have been for about 15, 20 years or so, but some of these were old in the area. Now, interestingly, one of the major effects of the local economy, if you look past the damage to the building, and sometimes it pays to, there's a sign here that's advertising a rugby game between Australia and Italy in the Rugby World Cup, some minority sport that some of you might have heard about, but for New Zealand it's pretty important. And there were going to be some of the major games of the Rugby World Cup held in Christchurch. After the September event, that was changed and they were moved to other places. And as we found out in February, it's probably a damn good thing they did too. But that meant that the city and the region lost tens of millions of dollars just from the direct consequence of that event not happening, let alone the impact on their sporting and recreation facilities. But we might see a bit more of that later. This is another image of that Joan showed a little bit later from that road she showed with the damage was. They're trying to straighten it back out. There was about a 3-metre horizontal offset, about a metre vertical. It's being tidied up now. Farmers have gone in and tidied up the fields because they want to get their whatever they've grown there, crops or grass, back in as quickly as possible. Here's some local liquefaction. One thing that took some people by surprise who hadn't had the benefit, I think, of like people like me to worry about this stuff for them, was that even if there wasn't liquefaction per se, there was still movement in the ground, lateral movement in towards waterways, and in this case, and in many cases, the bed of the stream lifted as well. So that meant that there was future increased risk from flooding. And then there's direct impact on infrastructure. This is a gas station on the eastern side of town, often with the movement in the ground. Again, even if there wasn't liquefaction per se, there was percolation effect. So the gas tank lifted up as the ground moved. All the connections many of the connections would be at least damaged, if not broken. So there were lots that were damaged like this. And we also found as a result of this, we'd done a survey previously, but this certainly confirmed that out of the 70 or so gas stations in the Christchurch area, only about 2 had alternative generation to even be able to pump the gas out of the ground if they weren't damaged like this. That's changed somewhat now. And those that did have generation on the eastern side of town were still able to operate, made very good money. So there's an incentive there to do that. So this is just an outline of some of the costs. In New Zealand, we have, I'll ask the question. Who here has earthquake insurance for their residential property? Excellent. I would imagine that's pretty high for most parts of this state at least. That's probably because you're self-selected to be here because you take these things seriously, right? And so you should too. In New Zealand, though, the cover is it's about 95%. Because if you have household insurance for your property, and also even if you're a renter and you have contents insurance, you then automatically become part of a government scheme that's run by the Earthquake Commission. So you have your contents insured up to $25,000 and the insurance company would cover the difference. And for the property, the building itself and a little bit of the ground around it, that's insured for up to $100,000. And then again, the insurance company would pick up the difference. So that means that, it's good on the one hand, with high level of insurance. On the other, it might mean that people might build in places that they might not in other locations because they've got that cushion. And insurance companies will insure in places where in other jurisdictions they wouldn't because they don't have that underwriting there to carry a lot of the cost, for smaller events at least. But it resulted in about $2 billion, and I believe the fund had something like $4.5 billion in it. So that was okay. We can deal with that. So that's a levy off on top of your normal insurance. But there were about 2,000 to 3,000, probably a few more actually, that were uninhabitable at that stage. In many cases, though, people were still living in their homes because what they didn't want to do, because they knew they'd have to be repaired later, in many cases perhaps knocked down and rebuilt. But if they moved out then and there and had the accommodation, the alternative accommodation paid for, they could get that out of their insurance. So with your contents insurance, whatever you'd insured your contents for, you would generally be able to get that out as well to cover emergency accommodation. And that would, for most people, cover them for maybe a year, if they're lucky, longer if they had a high level of insurance. So people often stayed in their own homes, knowing they'd need it later, so they'd hold on to it and use it. And a lot of people went to friends and family as well, a lot more than some response agencies anticipated. So there was some need for mass lodging with in mostly school gymnasiums, but in this event it only lasted about a week, and really there were only about 1,000 people who went there. Most of them didn't actually need it for shelter purposes. They just wanted to be somewhere where they could get support from other people. Some were just going for the free food and the hot showers. Some are there for other reasons, but that's another story. So this is, again, some of that indication of where some of the aftershocks were. That one there just about indicates where my house is. It's up on solid rock. Been damaged a bit. Certainly out of flood risk and tsunami risk, but I'm an emergency manager, so it should be. This is just a sequence of events. One of the interesting things with anything like an earthquake, things lead up to that means that the consequences will be different if they hadn't happened or if other things had. And then there's things that occur afterwards. So I'll just take you through this very quickly. Christchurch City Council was in the process of moving its Emergency Operations Centre, EOC, from a very earthquake-prone building to a less earthquake-prone building. So the whole council was moving back with it. The group controller and city council staff, the key city council response manager, were on leave. I was on an international disaster relief course in Wellington, and the city council had just begun to review its earthquake-prone building policy. There's a requirement in New Zealand, it's been in place for about 3 years, that local authorities would identify all of the buildings in their area that might be earthquake-prone. And Christchurch, when they did that initially 3 years ago, had identified about 7,000 that might fall in that category. That does not include single-story residents, only larger buildings, 7,000. So then the quake struck. There's all the damage, we know. But the Christchurch City were in a difficult position. There's something to think about as far as response facilities are concerned, but in this part of the world, they seem to be taken very seriously anyway. They couldn't use either. Series of offshore aftershocks, if you like. Now, these were on very separate fault lines, so technically they're probably not aftershocks. They are earthquakes on another fault line. But they happen up the big one, so as Jon said, it's just semantics. They make stuff fall down and break. But that was a significant tsunami hazard, near-shore tsunami hazard, where if they actually caused the damage that they could in that area, there would be a 20-metre wave arriving within 20 seconds, affecting the communities in that northern part of the region, but not so much elsewhere. So you try and plan for that in exercises. This is an image, didn't have the writing on the wall, I put that in, from the quake. Try and design exercises, and people say, nah, it'll never happen like that. If people say that, I think that's even more reason to plan for it, because it damn well will. We need to take these things seriously. So there were some coordination issues that came up in that event. One thing we need to do better, and some feedback I've had since I've been here, is that rapid impact assessment and reporting that and analysing it is something we need to do effectively. And what we need to do is reach out into communities more effectively too, to hear from them what's happening, the real things that are happening, rather than just what we see as we drive past, or as I tend to do when I fly over in a helicopter. We've got to make sure that the planning that we have in place is effective and is going to be used. If it's not going to be used, then we need to go back and rewrite it, or throw the book away and do something that will work more appropriately. There's a tendency for some agencies and local authorities in particular to want to just do the business as usual stuff and do more of it, but it's not like that. Disasters are different. There's people in the community who have needs, and we need to identify what they are and make sure that they're getting the right support, or just enable them to do what they need to do to support themselves. So there's a tendency just to do what we normally do. with more intensity. One of the major issues, though, without going into the others in any detail, is community resilience. Communities may be, and they generally will be, a lot more resilient than the official agencies will give them credit for. We did some work in Canterbury about a year before this event happened, and included focus groups with a lot of people in the community. And what we heard, a lot of people would get what we would expect responses from them about preparedness, and some wouldn't. They understood the hazards. In fact, we found that most people in the community understood what the hazards were that they faced, and they had a reasonable understanding what the likelihood was. It didn't mean that they would necessarily do anything about it. There are other drivers to whether they'll do something or not. But what we heard from the 18 to 35-year-olds, sort of university students and people starting work or a few unemployed, was different. And one of the young guys in particular, I sat in on a few while the team that we had doing the work, so I had the benefit of sitting behind the glass. They couldn't see me. It was a bit spooky, but it was good, very useful exercise. And what he said was, when they were talking about preparedness, he said, we're not going to prepare. We're not going to put food and water in our cupboards today. We're lucky we've got beer to see us through to tomorrow. And the more you tell us to, the less likely it is that we will do it. We don't listen to our parents. We're going to listen to you. But what we will do is we will, when a disaster strikes, we will be out on the streets and we will be helping the people who need it. What we will expect from them is that they will be able to feed and water us. What we expect from the agencies is they'll support us in doing that. So, you know, and I spoke about that at a conference about a month before this earthquake happened. A lot of my colleagues didn't really take that seriously. They said, nah, that's not right. They're young, stupid, apathetic, just like my kids at home. Yeah, so there's some lessons to be learned. There were thousands of students went out on the street. They were very well self-organised. They used social media to do it. It did help that they were still up and running, of course, but they made a huge impact on the community. And then there was another group, which this was called the Student Army. But there was another one called the Farming Army. The rural communities came in and helped as well. Some of them bought tractors that were a bit too big for the streets that were there, and it caused a bit of mayhem themselves, but it was still their hearts in the right place, and they made a huge difference too. Jones showed you that image of that big sand pit with the diggers in it. You know, total through both events, there was at least 400,000 tonnes of silt that had to be removed from the city. We're trying to work out what we can make from it and sell it. You know. There's a recovery structure. I won't go into that in detail, but it includes a whole range of things. This was what was intended to be in place. It was what our guidelines said. One thing that it didn't include enough of, though, particularly in its development and the training for it. This presentation will be available if people want to get it later, I think. But yeah, the politicians weren't included sufficiently. So when it struck, they wanted to do something that included them, and rightly so too. So, and this was another project I was involved in, and one of the something we've learned from that. We need to make sure they're included. So, if it was put into an organisation chart, it would look something like that. And this is what we activated initially in response. So we looked at the community part, the infrastructure part, the economy, and the natural environment. Major impact on the natural environment too. And it will report through a regional committee of all of the mayors of the whole region. But this only affected 3 local authorities. So that was a fatal flaw in the plan, because those 3 mayors didn't feel the need, and nor should they have done, to have to work and put votes through, including the other mayors in the region. So there was no need for that, so a different model needed to apply. So they came up with this model, which was a commission, a committee, if you like, and only those 3 mayors were on it, not the others. There was a chair appointed by the government. New legislation was put through to support all of this. The regional council chair, the regional authority that I work for, was there as well. There was a social subject matter expert and a structural engineering subject matter expert. They reported directly to the minister. And it was a good opportunity for coordination, but they had no decision-making authority. So it didn't really result in appreciable coordination occurring. So again, some lessons to be learned as we went along. One of the things that was focused on post the September event was some very innovative, projects to attempt to stabilise the terrain, particularly around the waterways where lateral movement or liquefaction would occur. So in the liquefaction areas, if they could, they would move the houses. In some cases, they would be able to leave them there if they could sufficiently compact the soil around them and add more rock or crushed brick. There's plenty of that lying around. And then in some places, though, near the waterways, they would, usually there were roads beside the waterways. They would take the roads out or put thousands of piles into them, but effectively build a dam around each side of those waterways and then put the houses back inside them, or then rebuild the houses, repair the houses that were damaged. And then the critical infrastructure would then go back in as well. That was the plan. That was going to cost hundreds of millions of dollars. There were issues about insurance, though. Before that, New Zealand was very well insured. It became a bit more difficult to get insurance after that, understandably. The Central Business District, a lot of focus on getting that back up and running, getting businesses back in there, even though a lot of the buildings were damaged. So there's a balancing act to try and get that happening again. But there's some real opportunities, as Jon mentioned this earlier. There was an opportunity to make the central city, in particular, a better place to be. That, like many cities in the Western world, had been in decline for a long time. Suburban shopping malls had been developing over the last 30 years or so, and in Christchurch's case, less controlled than they were in some. So it was suffering from a sort of a donut effect, hollowing out at the centre. There was a chance to do something different and reinvigorate the central city. Opportunity certainly to put more resilient infrastructure in place where it was damaged, where sewage mains were damaged, where water supplies were damaged. So it's an opportunity to go in, and this is what some of the authorities, the agencies had for their asset management plan. They would keep chipping away and improving their infrastructure over time, but they knew that if a major earthquake happened, that would be an opportunity to build a whole lot of it better. Well, they had that opportunity now. But would they have the skills and the available to do that? Was industry able to support that, and how would industry be affected by the event as well? So those things were not entirely clear. One big issue was what about accommodation for the residents, particularly as this work was going on. So they're predominantly using city parks and to the community to the north as well. Some of them were used as temporary villages, were beginning to be planned to move people in them. They hadn't really been started to be put in place by the time February came around. But would there be enough accommodation for staff coming in to do the rebuild as well? Some big challenges there. And some questions for us. One, of course, was, well, we didn't know where that fault line was. Where's the next one going to be? Or might it be the Alpine fault? Was this a precursor? Was this a foreshock to what might be the next big one? We still don't know that, actually. Will those buildings that were damaged, will they survive whatever might come next? Will the risk reduction with the earthquake-prone building policy have had time to bring about mitigation? Oops. Yeah, and given if particularly if it was a different time of day or in a different location, would the impact be different as well? Would there be the coordination that we need to support that response? And would those recovery guidelines we had before that were modified, would they apply, or would something response and recovery-wise be required? It's more innovative than we had in place previously. We were hoping that we'd have a long time to find that out. Of course, we didn't. So on the 22nd of February, there had been a lot of aftershocks in between, particularly on the 26th of December, one near the centre of the city as well. In fact, probably almost, in fact, closer to the city than the location that Jon showed you earlier. So the City Council had started moving back into their building. The Recovery Commission was well and truly in place. Some lessons being learned from it. We're putting arrangements in place to make sure that any future response was better coordinated, although it was probably one of the better managed responses we've certainly had in New Zealand, but there was always opportunity to improve. A lot of buildings had been assessed and most have been returned to. Some were being demolished because they were too dangerous, and that in itself was causing a lot of problems in the central city. But most of the regional and local emergency managers, including the fire chief, police chief, ambulance chief, senior staff from the District Health Board and myself and other controllers, we're in Wellington talking about the September event. So this is several hundred kilometres to the north in the capital city, which is also, in fact, got a higher earthquake risk than Christchurch, but we still go there. So the City Council's building was damaged. Our emergency coordination centre at the regional level, which is designed to withstand an 8.4 earthquake, is still there now, still fully functional, other than the fact that there's a 5-storey building on one side and a 10-storey building on the other, threatening to fall on it. So we've made other arrangements. And that building was opened, I think, the year before I started there, so about 10 years ago. And I always wondered about that, the reassurances that were made. Another, I told you so. But major damage in the CBD, a lot more damage in those residential areas. You'll see some maps shortly. A lot more damage this time to water and wastewater, as Joan said, because of the proximity and the shaking that went on. The first ever state of national emergency for New Zealand was declared. Some people said there never would be at a senior level. There was, and it worked particularly well. Those inner city stock banks were even more badly damaged than the first time round. And then, of course, there were spring tides on the way and heavy rain was predicted. That emergency management system that I was involved in initiating and getting that running, we were supposed to be training for it that week. Well, that's been postponed. But as you know, this was a much more challenging event, much more damage, and you'll see some stats in a minute. That original legislation that was brought through under urgency, but with 100% vote of Parliament, was then modified significantly, but particularly in relation to what was the Commission now became an authority, and I'll show you the organisation of that. It now has decision-making powers. But this event was just 10 to 1 in the afternoon. Now, it was on a Saturday. If it had been during the week, it probably would have been more severe than it was, because there would have been more people sitting in cafes, business people, etc. But this is what made people stop. The fact that 181 people died. There were probably about 160 that had died immediately, and the rest died later. The health services were affected quite severely, but the emergency department, where my wife's an emergency nurse, were able to continue. The ceiling collapsed in their waiting room. They felt the hospital moved towards the river, and a lot of damage was done. Within 10 minutes, she described it as a zombie movie, people then walking in with lungs hanging off, etc. So, and major effort went into finding and rescuing people. And there was a huge number of rescues made, most of them actually by people in the street, supported by the emergency services. The emergency services then came in. And then we had a huge number of urban search and rescue teams, including one from the States that came in. One from Japan, one from China, particularly for them because a lot of their nationals died in this, particularly in those English language schools. So they came. The emergency social services in the first couple of weeks, that number of people immediately got support. But interestingly, 7,500 students were displaced. All the schools were closed for, I think, 2 weeks anyway as a result, because most of the teachers and the children and the families, they were affected by it too, and they had to get themselves back together. But I'll show you some more about that a little later on. So these are some of the images that Joan showed of it. Again, so there were more thousands of students out in the street again. The Army was out again. A whole lot of community stuff went on. Yep. Oh, that photo that Joan had, that was about, where that car was dipping its light. About 2 hours after the quake. Yep, so they were trying to get from one place to another. These are later that day, later that evening, sun going down. So this is what it looks like immediately after. This is probably about 45 minutes. So this is not a stream, this is a crossroads. So there's about 1 metre deep of water there with the silt in it. And then it settles. So here, this is the photo that Joan had as well. So that's now mostly dry in that photograph. So you can sort of see that it was higher and it started to come down. And then a lot of these houses, this is in the area of Bexley, where that community will not be re-inhabited. There's still some people living there now, but probably about 2% of the population that was there before. And that is a relatively recently built subdivision. Big questions being asked in New Zealand about the decisions that were made to allow that to happen. And it's fully understandable as to how. But it does mean that the planning regime that was in place meant that there weren't opportunities to sufficiently consider the risk of building in certain areas. And whether it was liquefaction or shaking, lateral movement, and then particularly in the June event, which is when those boulders predominantly came down through houses, although that one I think that the photo Joan showed was in the February event. Being close to potential rockfall, being at the top of cliffs that might then fall, being at the bottom of cliffs that might then fall on. There are thousands of houses now that are empty because of that risk. Some of them are still absolutely pristine, but it's too dangerous to go back. A very challenging process to try and work out what to do with it, because the cost of securing it may be worth a lot more than the building, so it might be better to just pay them to go somewhere safe. Meanwhile, they're in limbo. This is a 1940s, 50s building sort of stuff. This is concrete block. And this is up on the hill. This is where, in that event, and so Jones showed you the shake, the graph showing how much shaking there was. On the hills, in the February event, the acceleration was about 2.1 Gs in places. In the June event, when this house was particularly damaged, and others, including neighbours of mine, in some places that was measured at 1.7 Gs horizontal and 2.3 Gs vertical. Some houses just blew apart. How there weren't more people that died in that environment. We're very lucky, actually. But there were a lot of injuries that managed to be dealt with. So, yeah, the energy, and I'm not aware of any building code that takes sufficient consideration, and maybe it's difficult to do so, but the energy release on solid rock that these houses are built on a hill, yes, they take into account shaking, they to some extent take into account unstable soils, but the energy that's released is something that we need to start thinking about, I think, and it may just be about location. Avoid it. This is down the bottom of the hill site I see as I drive to work most days. Although they've gone in and got most of this personal effects out. When I took this early on, the piece there's still clothes hanging in the wardrobe. No one was hurt here. There's no one in the bedroom at the time. This is a brand new house up on one of those hills. Now, the people were still in this for a time, again, because they were trying to make other arrangements. Often, though, even if the houses were intact, particularly in these areas, there was significant acceleration. There's no way they will ever go back just because of the experience they had, and including being in apartment buildings in any of the events. Anything over about 4 stories, people were thrown around, including the 9-story police station. Some of them were very reluctant to go back. It's still standing, but we've got a plan in place now to put a very earthquake-resistant multi-agency coordination facility together that will cover that. Yeah. Have moved out from the February event, at least 30,000. Now, a lot of them have come back. There's probably a deficit at the moment of at least 10,000 though. So out of the affected area, that's about 10%. Yeah. And I'll show you some of how we tried to measure that. But others are coming back as well. So out of that 30,000 that left, the population numbers have come back, but a lot of them are not the people who left. They're people who are coming back, and, well, there's thousands of insurance assessors and building assessors, for one thing. The Earthquake Commission went from having a staff of about 7 to 12 before the event to now having 2,000 people. So people are kind of understanding they haven't got their checks yet. Some are not so. But anyway, this is the central city. Mine was in the Post last week. Okay. That was for the first event. This is some of the, an outline of some of the things that occurred. I've talked through most of that already. But one of the significant things was, and you saw some of the images, and very good images of Jones actually, from the 19th and 20th century buildings, some of them quite recent, that were damaged significantly. The fact that our coordination facilities were compromised, but we were able to work around that because we had some degree of mobile capability, meant we could still coordinate. And then we all ended up in the Christchurch City Art Gallery. I'm not sure if I've got any images of that here. Very earthquake-resistant building, but it too had a 14-story apartment building waving away beside it. We won't be going back there. But by now, although it wasn't apparent at that stage, but there's probably about 20 billion, probably more actually, when we start looking at the longer-term costs of the recovery. So in relation to the earthquake in Japan, it was much bigger magnitude and had some horrendous damage and death toll. Proportionately, this is 3 times the cost to the New Zealand economy that the Japanese quake was, though. Thankfully, though, a lot of that is going to come back into the country through the reinsurers in Zurich and London. So it's actually going to be a positive impact on our economy. It's actually going to help us get out of the recession, or at least survive through it to some extent.
Better grab that quick.
Yeah, true. Yeah. Hopefully it's not in euros in Greece or something. Not if there's anything left there. We'll take Deutschmark. So this is cafe. So people, this happened at lunchtime. So people left. There's still wine in some of these glasses. People left their jackets with their wallets and, cell phones and a whole lot of stuff. So there's a big effort to try and get that back together so people could get that back again. Some of these images were quite poignant. But as I said, this huge, both organised but also emergent response, people being rescued. Don't need to talk about that any more than Joan has done. Just another image of the CTV building. Now, so this was not only the local TV company, and that's it afterwards, and it almost immediately went up in flames. So there were very few rescues from here. But it also had some medical practices and an English language school and a whole range of things. So some very sad stories from there. And this is that Pinegold Guinness Corporation building. Now, this building is pancaked. So there were a lot of rescues able to be achieved from this building and over probably about 48 hours or so. Is that right? They volunteered to do that. And look, it wasn't very casual actually. But by that stage, it hadn't moved much for some time. So that's probably 2 days into it, I think, at least the next day. But there was movement occurring while they were still in there, and but there was another opportunity to test some equipment that with what Joan showed earlier. You see those initial shocks coming in before the big hit happens, maybe 10 seconds sometimes. We had some sensors out there, and this is an innovative company, a startup IT company that wants to get into this business. They had sensors around the place that would then immediately, if they felt an event like that happening, send it to a cell phone, dedicated cell phone on the chest of the urban search and rescue teams in the building, and they would then have some time to then roll to safety or get out, usually just to roll to a more safe position. And they proved quite successful, so we've been learning a lot from this event. There's some iconic buildings. This is a beautiful old building in the central city, and that's it in the process of being brought down. After the September event, I don't know if you can see, but there's some cross-cracking in the building here. It was hoped it would be able to be saved, but after the February event, it wasn't. It's coming down. That's the Christchurch City building, the old post office that they were going into as their new office. So they put protective mesh down here to try and protect it while the building's coming down. They're just moving back in there this week, I believe. Has anyone here been to Christchurch? No, it's a Kiwi accent or two, so okay, thank you. This is Christchurch Cathedral, the chalice. That's the Forsyth Star building, I think. It's coming down due to the damage that was caused. So this is after this February quake. This support structure was built off-site and then rolled in on tracks to attempt to secure the building while they reconstructed it. Well, I got a text from my wife today. They've just made the decision. This is going to be totally deconstructed, not demolished, it's going to be deconstructed. They're going to try and save as much of it as possible and then put as much of it back together. It won't be just unreinforced rock and masonry, though. It'll be a different style of building. At one stage, there were thought to be about 20 people under here, or when it was over here, actually, or inside the building. So that they would not have survived. But interestingly, again, another innovative approach. It had been heard that there might be people trapped inside. It was very dangerous to get in. And in this case, they put a steel tunnel built off-site, split up to the door so they could then get in safely. and have a look around. At the Catholic Cathedral that Joan showed the image of, it was too dangerous to do that, so they got a little 4-blade helicopter that you run from your iPad, with some fenders put onto it so that as it went through the windows, it didn't have any glass in them, it wouldn't rip itself to pieces. With a video camera, it went in and they could see that there was no one trapped there, so they didn't need to put anyone at risk to be able to make sure that it was clear. So some really innovative approaches. Even more modern buildings were damaged too. This one's about 2 years old. It hadn't yet sold all of the apartments in it. This is a closed gas station in front, still not opening. I don't think it will open again, from what I've heard. But that had a beautiful view out over the estuary that I showed you on that aerial photo earlier, the map. Also with the sewage ponds, but you wouldn't know that unless someone told you. But I don't know if you can pick, but this building has about a 3-degree lean to the right, towards the estuary. So it's been evacuated, and they will not go back unless they can somehow straighten it back up. But this is the estuary itself. This is all, a ground that's been filled, and it's just sitting on silt. So what the future of that will be, I don't know. You could have bought one of those apartments for, at least $400,000 or $500,000 New Zealand dollars. Couldn't give them away now.
Was there any geotechnical work done on major projects like that on those
yeah.
where you have?
Some areas, it's a requirement for them to do so, but generally not where the liquefaction problem is. It's generally to the north of the city where there's peaty soils that you start building on them and they start moving anyway. These soils, the way the land use plans were put together, hadn't yet sufficiently taken into account this risk. They did to some extent. The ones that we have been developing over the last 2 years, a regional policy statement that takes it seriously, and now a change in legislation that requires local authorities to give effect to the regional policy statement or any national policy statement. So it's got a big section on hazard, and the local authorities now need to give effect to it, and they want to. Previously, they felt that they didn't have to. And, of course, the pressure from developers was that they, so it's always a balancing act. But certainly after this, it will be looked at a lot more seriously. Yeah. And so I'll talk a bit more about that a little later, perhaps. This is, we use the same method of placarding damaged buildings. This is after the February quake. These are all buildings that have a red sticker, which means they're too unsafe to go back into. So you can see the concentration of damaged buildings in the central city. This is Hagley Park. A lot of people call Christchurch a garden city. It's going to become more of a garden city in the future as this area here will be largely depopulated and there will be riverside parks put in place. What's happening though is I'll show you another image later, but a lot of them will probably move to the west. People have already. They've moved out of there and they're staying with friends or family, or they've rented elsewhere, and particularly communities surrounding Christchurch, they can have a relatively easy commute into the city. And this is the hill area. That's Littleton, the port of Littleton. You can see the concentration of damage in the historic part of Littleton. The rock that Joan showed is that red dot there is the house that the rock went through. These are multi-million-dollar houses falling off the cliff, and my house is just there. Not multi-million dollars. So this is a quite interesting map because it shows where the impact from the September quake is that in blue. Brown is just the February event, and the red is both September and February. So some of these areas here, this is particularly relatively lower socioeconomic. So this is the lower insurance in these areas generally. And so they've been hit twice. Well, at least twice, because some of the intervening events as well have been enough to cause damage and liquefaction. So one of the ways of finding that people have gone and where they've gone is using the New Zealand Postal Service as an intelligence source. Do you know that your postal agency has an intelligence agency within it? Yeah. Didn't you hear Joan say that I used to be an intelligence officer? That's what your file says you would say. So you can see that where the concentrations of people have moved, people or businesses actually, so significant concentrations moving out of here and in these areas. These are all either low-lying valley suburbs or the major damages along the cliff tops. And in the valleys too, where there's some damage. Yeah. Yep. Like the variable shaking, or so some of these are liquefaction. In here, it's mostly shaking. This is liquefaction and shaking. Here, this is where the major vertical and horizontal acceleration occurred, and where landslides have occurred or are at risk of occurring. So a lot of people have moved from here, not because they have to, because their house has been damaged, because it might be. Yeah, interestingly though, during the response, something to think about this, people in this area houses were probably average, I don't know, $200,000 to $300,000. In this area, you could easily find houses, up to $3 to $5 million. These people were relatively mobile, and particularly in this area that wasn't as hard hit, they were often in relatively casual employment, or they were on welfare benefits of one sort or another, didn't have strong connections to the area. Many of them have gone. The unemployment rate in the city has dropped. Some of these people in the wealthier areas, though, was thought that they'll be fine. Many of them might be asset rich, but their businesses, if they're relying on the businesses in the city, they've got no cash flow. They're asset rich and cash poor, so some of them are actually in a worse position than people at lower socioeconomic. So it's something you need to take into account when you're doing a vulnerability analysis before emergency, and particularly during and after. This is some of the infrastructure damage. So this is just at one site where there's been movement, the stormwater drains being pumped out, and there's generators there to keep it going as well. It's going straight into local waterways, and the stormwater is full of sewage because it all becomes one. A lot of signs up about contamination in the waterways, but that's also affecting the beaches coming on for summer. They were declared safe about a month ago, but then there were more leaks detected, and then we had some more aftershocks and there's more damage. Oh, that's right. Joan said that there's difficulty now getting insurance due to aftershocks. The policy that's being applied, generally speaking, is that the insurance companies will start selling insurance again once there hasn't been a magnitude 5 for 6 months. That clock keeps getting reset about every month. And it was looking like they were spreading out. They generally were, but then we had a couple more. But yeah, so it may be some time before there's available insurance. If you've got an existing residential property and you want to build a new one or replace the one you've got, you'll be able to continue the insurance you have. But if you're trying to buy a new property and you're coming in from outside or another property, you may not get insurance. Businesses are certainly struggling to get insurance, and the local authorities cannot get insurance for their infrastructure. This was a lovely street alongside the Avon. I don't see the deformation, but these have become a significant feature in our communities. About 20,000 of them were bought from the States. A whole lot came from China. We also bought in a whole lot of sort of camp toilets, the chemical cartridge type that you put in an RV, that kind of thing. And this was an innovative approach to try and deal with some of those things. Initially, after the September event, and particularly in Kaiapoi to the north, there was an attempt to keep people in their homes. So they put these tanks, which are about 1,000 litres, what's that, 250 gallons or so, to put in the ground, and they would connect several houses to them, so their wastewater would go in that, and a truck would come by about once a day and empty them out. But all the aftershocks, they just kept popping back up. So it's worth a try, didn't work. But they've been left there and they've been spread out. In fact, there's industry in Canterbury, because it supports the farming industry, was able to start producing these en masse. So they're in the community, so that people who were, rather than going out to the portable toilets, could use their porta potties and then empty them into these tanks, take the lid off. There were hand cleaning, and that was left over from pandemic planning, a whole lot of supplies of hand cleaning, initially at least. So people were able to sort of live in a more normal environment at home. And if they were unable to carry and empty the things, the toilets themselves, there was a whole new service sector developed to support that. Usually it was friends and family. Some people got entrepreneurial about it and started charging for it. And that was cool because it was a community meeting their own needs rather than the social agencies having to deal with that. No, some did, but that made it more of a problem actually, because then the people started flushing, who knows where it would go. Often it would come out under your house or your neighbour's house or whatever, so it was better to encourage them to keep using the portable toilets. Yeah, so even where the water has been put back on, either it's through repairing the in-ground infrastructure, but in a lot of these areas, these sorts of areas, it's across the ground. So the bright blue polyethylene pipes going along the streets, they'll go underground slightly at intersections, then they feed every house with water. But many of them still can't. They can use the showers, etc., but they can't use their toilets. And particularly in some of those areas, they're just biding their time. There's now been a decision made that in many of these areas, there's been an offer put to them now. They'll get the $100,000 from the Earthquake Commission. The insurance companies, as a deal with the government, the insurance companies will pay out the difference to the taxable value of the house, the land tax value in 2007, and the government will pay out the taxable value of the land at that stage too. So for some people, they're actually doing quite well if their property was valued low. A lot of people might have got more. Some, they're losing tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars because of that, because of just where their house was valued at the time, particularly if they've done some improvements to it. So there's a bit of negotiation, but a wholly innovative approaches had to be taken to that. And we've got an election happening next month, so it'll be interesting to see what happens. This is near my house. That's my dog. She got a good wash after this. But, this is the sort of thing that happens. So a lot of the buildings and residential properties in particular were damaged. They weren't weathertight anymore. Although under the Earthquake Commission processes put in place, if you had a place that wasn't weathertight but you wanted to stay in it, they'd send a strike team out and go and fix it for you, which was great. Then we had this heavy snow come in June and then another one in July, and many didn't have heating back in yet either. But there was not much in the way of major problems from that. But what happened was we encouraged people. A lot of public information work was done in this response. So we saw this front coming, the first front about a week out, started encouraging people to, if they didn't yet have heating, to make contact with the right agencies and they may get it. Or if that wasn't going to be viable for them, they didn't want to pay the power bill either, find some friends or family to go and stay with while this was happening, and then they would be in a better position. And they didn't need to stay long enough that their welcome would be worn out. They might need it again next time. And it worked extremely well. So the community resilience was absolutely superb. But there was a role for the agencies to encourage that and then provide that safety net for people who couldn't either. This was an innovative approach that was taken to schools. So these are all the red dots are the schools that were seriously damaged in the quake. This is Hagley Park in the centre of the city. So you can see that it was the east of the city that was most badly damaged, and the west see it a lot better. This is a school that my two teenage kids go to. So for about 6 months, they had to, as was arranged with all of these schools, the host schools would do the morning shift from about 7:30 till 12:30. They and their teachers would all leave. Cost a lot of money to reroute all the school buses, and new services had to be put on, because often people would, walk or get dropped by their parents at their normal school. But now they had to get a bus to get there and then be taken home. And so then the guest students would arrive with their teachers, and they go from 1 until about 4:30. My kids loved it. Slept until 11, say goodnight to us as we went off to bed. It was great. It was a real challenge, though. It's going to be interesting to see over the next few years and then into the future what impact this is going to have on their education. The university, which sits about here, it was closed for a long time, about a month, but then put in temporary classes and marquee tents. Temporary buildings were put up, a very innovative approach taken, but they are having to readjust how they're going to manage that university into the future. Yep. Not as such. We don't do stress debriefing as such, but yeah, I know what you mean. Yes, there was, and but particularly now it's becoming needed. Initially it wasn't. It's actually the parents who needed it because their lives were totally disrupted by this too. And in fact, those who are probably hit hardest by this are the dean of teachers. It's totally changed their method of teaching. They've had to be much more delivering information to the students. They don't have the time to have the active educational experiences they might have done, or they're getting better at that as time goes by. But what we're finding now, or the Ministry of Education are finding in its schools, and the health services who are working in conjunction with them, is that a lot of high-flying students, it's now getting near the end of the year, the exams are coming around, they're expecting to get really good marks, and they're worried now that they might not. The kids at the lower end of the spectrum don't really, it doesn't affect them so much. Their aspirations might not have been as high. And some in the middle are worried as well, but those at the top, though, are the ones seeking support at the moment. And so are their parents, because it's their aspirations that they're trying, Did you have a follow-up? Yeah. No, I'll talk about it briefly if you like. A lot of money went in post the September quake, thinking there would be huge psychological need. And this was it was all done with best intentions by senior people in social agencies. Some of that was a pull effect, though, from people who wanted to sell and provide those services rather than demand from the community itself. So in reality, that most of those services weren't needed to the extent that was envisaged. But then that resource was available for the later event, really, so the funding hadn't been, not much of it had been expended. So there's a lot available. Most of that is provided by non-government agencies, a lot within faith groups and other support groups as well. But then the high-level mental health services have only really found a significant increase in their cases just in the last month or so. But we expect that to get worse. We think a lot of people have been holding out till the end of the year, hoping things will get better. Yep. Yeah. And then next year, I think people will get through the summer, maybe. Depends. I mean, I've got surfer friends. If they can't surf in the summertime, they're going to need some. Well, they'll probably self-medicate. But I think into next year, when next winter comes around, there's going to be major problems. There's going to be, because of the changes in the schools, there's still about 3,500 kids who haven't come back. There's going to be about 250 teachers laid off next year. The university is laying off staff next year, although they're asking for voluntary redundancy from that. There's some industry has lost a lot of staff, so there's going to be changes like that. But that police have and health agencies have noticed an increase in domestic crime recently. I haven't heard since New Zealand won the Rugby World Cup whether that's changed or not, but there was an increase happening over that until just before I left New Zealand. Yeah.
Has the system, business system, still closed off?
I'll show you a photo shortly. That will certainly answer your question. I won't need to say anything. Cool. So that post-February, that land stabilisation project was abandoned. It just wasn't going to be a viable proposition. Some of those areas just won't go back to. Now, that might have, some communities think that was a bit premature. There's some that work could be done. It may do in future, but that's where it's sitting at the moment. So that means that there's now those houses that with some hope for, if you like. Now there isn't so much. So those people who thought things were okay after September or might get better later, they're a different scenario they need to deal with. The insurance thing's getting worse. Now, there are 1,700 buildings in the central business district that have either about 500-600 have come down already. Some came down of their own accord with the help from gravity and shaking, but otherwise they've been demolished or deconstructed. So that's going to take years to actually get through that project, and that's where I'll show the photo shortly. But again, there's a whole lot of opportunities. There's a central city plan. The city council has taken the lead on that as part of the recovery authority. And the feedback that they've had from that, it's not just a bunch of politicians making decisions in isolation. They've done huge consultation. They did a draft plan, and then it's gone out for consultation. They had a whole lot of workshops. They perhaps could have engaged with the business community more effectively. That's certainly what parts of the business community are saying now. They got like 50,000 suggestions that some staff have then had to collate, so that's feeding back into the plan. Within it, though, it suggested that the central city should downsize. It wasn't economic the way it was set up previously. So although there are a lot of buildings, and some of them will stay up to about 14 stories, but it was suggested that nothing should be over 7. And there's good geological reasons why you might want to do that. Anything over 7 stories, when the Alpine Fold earthquake happens, you won't want to be there. And also it will make a more livable environment as well. When the power goes out, 7 stories is just high enough for you to be able to get up and down. Well, if you're fit enough. There's still 2 floors in the base in the main public hospital that they won't put patients in because it's too difficult to get them down when something happens. So, but there is a project underway there was already one in place to build a new hospital later. There's already the Christchurch Women's Hospital, very, very new, the safest place in Christchurch to be. Base isolated, beautiful place, but the rest of it around it's been damaged. Questions about are there going to be enough skills to meet the needs? There's going to be new subdivisions for the lost suburbs. Where are they going to be? And this accommodation question is now looming even larger. This is a structure that's in place. Oh, that was the structure, in place now. So the lessons were learned from the September recovery structure that was put in place. So now we have something like that from the guideline and what's in place in Washington State as well. Framework-wise, this is a feature, though, that wasn't there previously. It's a major component. Legal services is huge, largely as a result of that, but also in relation to the land deals that are having to be cut with residents as well. It now has a chief executive officer, and he was previously the chief executive of the power company that did so well in those previous responses. So he's got a very good reputation in the local community, and he's trusted by them, and he can speak really well, really down-to-earth kind of guy. And then there's the minister, who was the same minister previously. Initially, he was referred to as the minister responsible for the earthquake. He didn't like that. See why? So he's the recovery minister. And we don't have a presidential style. We don't have governor or a president. We have cabinet. Well, they have prime minister, but they're directly responsible to cabinet. And then from here, and at this level, they link out to the mayors and the head of the regional council. And at this level and here, it goes to management and chief executive and those other agencies. So it's a much better structure. This is the central city. These vacant lots were not vacant lots before February. This is the green here is the Avon River. At this stage, it's not really a river, it's a meandering stream, but there's punts on it, with poles, just like on the Avon in England. Then it goes out here to the eastern area where the major liquefaction occurred. The township of Kaiapoi is up there to the north. We're going a little bit closer. So this area is still cordoned off. And a lot more of these buildings, in fact, this is the Bridge of Remembrance, so predominantly remembering the soldiers who went to World War I. The bridge is still intact. This area through here is next week reopening. They're bringing in, this is some of it here actually, bringing in shipping containers, about 160 of them, I think. And they're going to have temporary shops and cafes in this, which was a mall. And this is a major department store, Valentine's, which is seen as an anchor store for the centre city. And they want to get this open as a quick win because the second week in November is the Canterbury show weekend where people come in from all over the region. It's a big boost for the economy in the area. So they want to be able to demonstrate that things are happening. And it's going to be a good opportunity, actually. People will be able to come in. I think some of this will be open too. This is the photo of the cafe with the food sitting on the table still is just here. This is called the Strip. In the evening, it's nice and sunny through the trees, great place to hang out. So they're going to open that area again. Otherwise, most of the central city is going to be effectively closed for another couple of years. It'll progressively come back. But this is why it's not going to happen in a hurry. These are some of the key buildings that are going to be demolished over the next little while. Just go back slightly. The cathedral is that building there. That's the chalice that you saw in that photograph. So all around it, buildings are going to come down. And this is a police station here. It's coming down eventually, probably not in a hurry because they're still using it. And the 911 centre for police and fire is there as well. My office was just in here, where it's threatened by the 10-storey hotel next door, which I think is in the process of being demolished now. So yeah, it can't go back yet because there's so much more to do. But there's going to be a blank canvas. A new city will rise from the ashes and silt of this emergency. These are some of the questions that we still need to grapple with, though. So there's going to be new demographics, new people coming in, people have left. The age profile is going to change. A lot of older people have left. A lot of elderly care homes were evacuated, and unfortunately, as we know happens in that situation, quite a few people died. Not a lot more than probably would have died anyway, but it's just more sensational when they die. They get off a plane and they're not alive. But it has had an impact. And so, and some of those elderly care facilities, particularly because of where they were built, they're very vulnerable, and they probably won't go back either. Major issues there, but most of them will over time. There's questions about how effectively have the agencies engaged with the communities to ensure that the recovery that's in place is going to be sustainable and meet the needs of those organisations well beyond those who are currently making decisions. In the future, if you want to look for best practice in disaster recovery, and I'll give you the spelling later if you like, but look for Waimakariri District Council. That's the community to the north of Christchurch. They did it by the book, engaged with the communities affected within hours of the earthquake happening to give them reassurance and to ask them what their needs were. And that's continued through into the recovery process. Very good example. Others tried, they did it really well. Questions about where the infrastructure is going to be in future. You know, a lot of the power cables were underground. That makes it more resilient to snow events, but and it depends how it's designed, but it's more vulnerable to earthquakes. There's questions about how the in-ground infrastructure should be put back in place in the future. And there's a lot of it was actually quite old, so there's opportunities to do that much more effectively in the future. Do you want to worry about the amenity effect of having overhead power lines and telephone lines when it's actually a lot safer to have it there if there's an earthquake? You know, there's now a bit more of a balancing act required in making some of those decisions. The cities and the suburban areas, and in fact some of the larger and small towns nearby are changing, and they're changing quickly. Some of it, there was an urban development strategy for the greater Christchurch area anyway, that had some plans to bring about more density of development, build in other areas that hadn't yet been subdivided and developed. That 50 years of planning, so it was good to have done that, to vision what the community wanted its community to look like in the future. Some of that's been able to be pulled forward, and it's going to happen in 5 years rather than 50. But there's also new opportunities that come out of that as well. The historic context and fabric of the city's gone. If you want to go and look at a historic town, you've got to drive all the way through the hills and go out to Akaroa. Most of the historic part of the city in Littleton is not there anymore. At the start of the cruise ship season for New Zealand, with summer coming round, they can't go into the port of Littleton. You can get coal out, you can get cars in, and etc. But you can't. It's not safe to bring in passengers. So the cruise ships are having to go to Akaroa Harbour. A windfall for that community. A lot of them would have gone there by bus anyway, but they're going to do very well. But the roads are going to have to cope with 120 buses each time a cruise ship comes in that weren't designed for it every day that those ships are there. And so there'll be benefit for those businesses that are open in the central city, because a bit of disaster tourism doesn't hit. What about the future risks? So we've got this literally hanging over some of the communities, this very fragile rock now, which they thought was solid before. What about where communities, well, in some cases, particularly in the area to the northeast where the liquefactions occurred, that's now about 40 to 50 centimetres lower than it was before, so about 1.5 foot lower than it was before. So they're more vulnerable to flooding and coastal storm, and particularly tsunami in some cases. We do have a tsunami risk predominantly from earthquakes off Chile. So a range of things. Storm drains can't cope at the moment because they're filled with silt. So we get flooding happening even at the best of times now. And then stock banks have been damaged as well. What's the future going to be for industry and the economy in the region? It's going to be different. The university is probably going to have a significant component of its education and research that's about disaster management. but there are other things that will go. What's the future of emergency management? Some real big lessons learned from this. How do you work with the community? How should we structure more effectively? And some good decisions will be made from this. Some will be knee-jerk reactions, and we'll see what that means. But there's some real opportunities here as well. Some pre-event lessons, and the sort of stuff that you're doing now. Build the response and recovery roles and capability, and particularly relationships now. It's almost too late when that earthquake happens. Even if it's hard to do it in a way that enables people to come and work with you. Don't demand it, it won't happen. You don't need to demand things very often when emergencies happen. It's about having relationships where you can work together and talk with one another reasonably and come up with solutions that work for you and collectively. Use planning and response for accepted hazards to base your planning for the major ones. If people don't currently really believe that there's a major earthquake risk for your area, if that's what you're going to focus on, lever off some of the things that they do take seriously. You know, some of the things that made a huge difference in Canterbury was the very joined up approach we took to pandemic planning. So the health agencies, we knew them all by first name, the senior people. And we were able to work together very effectively. A lot of the resources that we put together for other events, and you saw the hand washing gel as one, was able to be turned to use for another. One very effective element of what they did, and I think Canterbury is being used as an example around the world as to how to better plan primary health response to an emergency, it was around what the general practices would do in a pandemic event. They knew that they would be hit really hard with infection. So they would centralise resources on a few key practices and rotate staff through where they could. And they would separate out the triage to where the people injured or the people infected in that case from the normal practice. It was absolutely relevant within the situation that we had on following the 22nd of February. And they just kicked their plan into place, modified it slightly, but everyone else knew that that's what they would be doing at a management level, and so did the community as well. And it was able to be communicated effectively. So use what you do well to build what you need to do for the hard things. On the other hand, though, you do need to plan for major consequences. We can't just build up for the little things. It doesn't add up. The sum of the parts does not add up to a whole for a disaster. Disasters are different. We need to imagine what the effects will be for major events. So use the maximum credible event scenarios. It's not and your exercises for response and recovery. Use those really challenging ones where you have to actually ask hard questions about what will the needs be and how will we meet them realistically. Don't let people say, oh, we'll deal with that, business as usual. I think business as usual, probably the acronym should apply it in a different way, but I'll leave that for another time. Include senior executives and politicians in that work. If you're in a position to do so, make sure that they're involved up front, because we saw what happens if they're not. It means that they don't have a place within it when it really happens, and or they will make decisions that are not linked to what's really happening in the response. So you've got to make sure that they're engaged. And so you've got to do that in a way that doesn't take up too much of their time, but it's engaging enough to make sure that it's real. And enable community resilience. The communities, we find anyway at least, don't need to be told what to do. We don't need command and control for the communities. They need to be supported. They need the information they need for them to make the right decisions, for them to be able to do the right thing. Yes, they need some assistance in places. They might need more security in places. They might need resources. But they're often very innovative, and we certainly saw that happening in Canterbury. and they were able to get resources that even if the agencies had tried, they wouldn't have been able to due to connections that they had in the communities. And whether they were connections to corporates or to back into their faith groups or to relatives elsewhere, it meant that they were often able to meet their needs. As agencies, we need to make sure we're in touch with them to find out what the gaps are and where we can support that. But it's about communication, it's about relationships. They're the sort of relationships that often you can't build too much beforehand, but you need to identify them during. And just as you're doing at the moment, you listen to people who come across the planet with slightly different accents, or go there yourself. You know, I'm not paid by the New Zealand Tourism Board to say that, but you know, if you get an opportunity to, if you're with an agency or an organisation that can help you get there, or you're just going to go on vacation anyway, go to some of these places where there've been challenging opportunities. Sometimes you can go and you can help, even if you're just as a volunteer. You get a feel for what's happening. It means you can come back and use that to inform the reality of the stuff you need to do at home. These are more focused for emergency managers. Get rapid impact assessment happening early, though, and make sure you've got the resources to analyse and manage that information. It's no use collecting information if it's just going to sit in a box. It doesn't help anyone. Well, it helps the ego of some of the people who think they're doing the right thing, perhaps, but it really doesn't help. You've got to project unified leadership early. There may be a spokesperson, and we had an extremely effective mayor in Christchurch, a former TV entertainment sort of compere. He was great. It didn't necessarily, though, indicate that there was a whole range of agencies who were there supporting the community. So, you know, did a wonderful job. And the second time round in February was done a bit differently, and there's sort of more faces who were there. He certainly had a role, but it was a bit more joined up. Yeah, make sure that during response that interagency coordination happens. It's not good enough just to have the heads of various agencies sitting in a room and saying they're dealing with stuff. The agencies need to be able to communicate what it is that they're dealing with. What are the problems and challenges that they have? What are the resource needs? What are the resources that they're using? And they might have available that they might be able to be used elsewhere. It needs honesty, and it needs commitment, and it needs to be led effectively. Focus on the community needs, though, in a lot of the planning and in the response. There's a tendency to go where the TV cameras have gone and shown where the damage is, and like the central city, but that's not where the community need is. The community need is out where people are suffering. The business community and the immediate response, that can wait. They do need to be involved in the recovery process early on, get that happening, but make sure the resources are going to the right places at the right time. And encourage innovation. Don't just lock people into silos and boxes that you might have said that that's what they're going to do in your planning, because the plan is only a list of good intentions. When an emergency happens, you need to be relatively flexible. Sure, some things need to be as you said they will, but other things you'll find the context is different and you need to do a little differently. And reward that and recognise that innovation when it happens. A lot of resources will come in from elsewhere. You've got to welcome them. It's difficult to do sometimes, particularly admitting that we need help, but we do. But make sure we coordinate with them. Don't just let them come in and go off and do their own thing, which is so easy. Make sure you work with them so that we have a coordinated approach. We've got to remember, though, the recovery is going to take time after all of that. And make the most of that opportunity. Some things decisions need to be made quickly, but most of the decisions, this process is going to take years. Take the time to make the right decision. Otherwise, you're going to live with further consequences. So just finally, it's going to be really helpful if we can better envisage what the impacts are going to be and what recovery will look like. What will we need to do to support that recovery? It doesn't mean having an answer for everything and trying to work out beforehand what's going to go and what's going to go in its place in detail, but have a sufficient understanding of what that's going to look like and who the various players are going to be. You need an adequate appreciation of what the physical aspects of that are and what the social parts, but don't kill yourself trying to get it too detailed, because it will always be different. Engage within your organisation with people you need to work with and you think that will have roles in future. Engage with partner organisations. Engage with those that you report to or you will depend on. engage with agencies that you need to support in the field, but particularly if you're an opportunity, you have the opportunity to, and it's part of your role, engage with the community. The better you engage with them beforehand, the better they will then engage with you during response, or they will do their own thing despite what you're doing rather than with you. Plan for it based on what you hear from those engagement processes and the visioning that you do. And then train, as I said earlier, based on those real challenging scenarios. From time to time, sure, you need to plan and train for sort of the less challenging things too, but make sure that there's a strategic approach to make sure we build the capability to deal with the really challenging ones and run those exercises. There's a really good program happening across Washington State that I like it so much I might have to come back and get involved in this. And then tell your communities what you're doing, because they need to know, particularly if they don't necessarily recognise the risk as well as you would hope that they do. Tell your communities why you're doing what you're doing and planning for and exercising for these emergencies, and then you need to include them in that conversation so that it's for them, and ideally you'll be doing it with them to some extent. But there's just a word of warning when you're doing that. Some really good research has been done by some of our colleagues back in New Zealand. They've identified that if you don't do that carefully, the communities will see the agencies planning for it, even if they, and in fact, if you're giving out preparedness education material to them and they see your logo on it, or they see you talking on TV or on a webcast or whatever, there's a very easy tendency for them to think, oh, well, that agency's dealing with it. I don't actually have to do anything. So you've got to be careful. So you've got to include them in those communications. And telling people what to do isn't necessarily the right way to do it. It's about engaging them in a conversation. It's got to be two-way. People will only act if they feel that they're part of it. If you just tell them, it will have little impact. One of the chief executives back after the September event said that what was going on, is certainly true after February 1, that the work that went on, whether they were people within agencies or in the communities with shelters and providing support in the communities, there was coordination happening within the services on the ground or emergency operations centres, etc. It was ordinary people carrying out extraordinary deeds. And that's what you'll see happening in your communities, with your people within your agencies and in your communities, and we need to enable that and encourage it and reward it. And I think you need to pat yourselves on the back for coming out on a night like this and listening to these sorts of things. But that's what it's all about. So thank you very much.